hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 140 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this, stop me if you've heard this before, rainy day in New York, because it rains every day in New York this time of year. You just have to tough it out. If you're catching this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today we'll have the 13th, hard to believe we're up to that many, the 13th entry in our continuing and apparently popular series, The Best Movie You've Never Seen. The movie is a mystery comedy, now more than 3 decades old, featuring somewhat of a polarizing figure for a variety of reasons, but it's a movie that received rapturous critical praise upon release. And from a contemporary perspective, if you Google this particular film, you'll see a crazy high 94% Rotten Tomatoes score. And particularly for comedies, it is a crazy good score. Most even terrific comedies don't score in the 90s. And this is a film that, if anything, the appreciation of what it does, the kind of mystery it throws at you, and the way it's able to still deliver laughs while also having kind of edge of the seat moments, it's a really good film. The movie is 1993's Manhattan Murder Mystery. The filmmaker is Woody Allen. Now, you probably don't know that Woody Allen, that's not his real name. He was born Alan Stewart Koenigsberg. He's always a bit of an outlier, an unusual guy. He was the sort of guy who would grow up in Brooklyn but not be a Brooklyn Dodger fan. He would be a Yankees fan. And his comedy was different as a much younger person. He did a little stand-up. He was a comedy writer. He worked for the Sid Caesar Show. Again, Woody Allen is, he's in his 80s now. He was born 1936. So we're talking about somebody that he was around for a really long time and doesn't work anywhere near as much as he used to. He used to just knock out movies so quickly. But I won't go into the scandals which could have derailed his career if they had turned out differently. He had a couple of scandals in the early 90s, but enough people in the business kind of had his back or supported him or felt whatever allegations were tossed at him were not really, that they were completely baseless. And sometimes you hate to say it, it's a cliche, but you find out who your friends are and just how much influence they can have or not. And we've certainly seen, not just recently, but going back in time, even during the terrible time of the Hollywood blacklist, where there were people who started to seep their way, in a good sense, back into the movie business because, no, this is bullshit. This is unfair what happened to them. And we see this all the time. And like anything else, if your friends have your back, you can survive an awful lot of difficult, dark times. It doesn't have to have anything to do with the movie business, just in life. So Manhattan Murder Mystery was filmed during this unbelievable series of crisis points in the life of its writer-director, Woody Allen. And from a certain point of view, it was probably good for him that he was making this kind of movie with people he had, and often, in many cases, had worked with previously, including the incredible, spectacular, amazing Diane Keaton, they had been in a relationship. They made a bunch of movies together, some of which they co-starred in. And there were movies like Interiors where Diane was, just the star of the movie. And she's so good. It's tough sometimes for young people who might know her for only her later work to sort of understand the spirit of prime Diane Keaton. And I would say that her prime goes all the way through the 90s, starting in the 70s. And she's still doing solid work in films like Something's Gotta Give, where I didn't love the movie. Her character is a little bit overwrought, but she's just fantastic. And what Woody does as filmmaker in this movie, even though, technically the expectation would be that his character would be the star, he knows that he has a powder keg, an explosive talent in a showy, really juicy role in Diane Keaton. And they play a kind of a dull aging married couple. They're supposed to be about 50. And Woody stays the hell out of her way. And sometimes the best performances are ones where one person just stays out of the way and allows their co-star to run shit and shine. And Woody artfully plays pretty much a clown, as sort of a neurotic, nebbishy a-hole that he played to spectacular effect in so many movies. But it works even better this time because he and Diane have such a beautiful chemistry. Sometimes you see couples in movies and you can't, well, they don't have any chemistry. And I don't mean physically, because I would argue that Diane had better physical chemistry with Jack Nicholson, with Warren Beatty, hell, with Steve Martin in the Father of the Bride movies. It's not about that, but it's about bouncing, it's the ping-ponging of these two characters of Larry and Carol Lipton. And one thing that Woody Allen was known for and was so good at is using real New York City locations, whatever permits he needed. And famously, there was a story when he was making Hannah and Her Sisters, which many people consider to be his finest achievement, even though Annie Hall got the hardware, winning Oscar in the year of Star Wars Episode 4. When Woody made Hannah and Her Sisters, he had to shoot in the hospital, and there were a lot of people that probably weren't too happy about it. So he spent a ton of money getting people, like schmearing them, to use a phrase that I've used before. We're saying, buy these people lunch, breakfast, dinner, whatever it is, pay this staff in the hospital who we're putting out, pay them as if they're part of the crew, whatever it was. He would go out of his way to make things easier. So in this movie, he shoots scenes in and around the Metropolitan Opera House, Lincoln Center, Madison Square Garden, 21 Club, Downtown Athletic Club, and other fantastic real-life New York City locations. And it adds to the verisimilitude, the almost cinema verite aspect of it. And Woody had begun experimenting, and this was very controversial at the time. See, controversy in Woody Allen, it's not always about his personal life. Sometimes it's about his stylistic filmmaking choices. And Woody Allen in this film, he had worked with some amazing cinematographers like Gordon Willis, who had done the Godfather films, and then Carlo De Palma, who worked on this movie. Sven Nykvist, another one who worked with Bergman that Woody also used. I think that he did interiors with Woody. That I'm not sure of. But Woody started to experiment with the so-called handheld camera. And it doesn't work as well in his previous film, which is the unbelievable Husbands and Wives. If you want to talk about somebody's psychoanalytic inner life being just thrown at the audience, there's your movie. Because Woody Allen and Mia Farrow were going through this very public and horrendous breakup. And they made a movie where their characters go through this horrendous breakup. Like, it's just fucked up. But that's what happened. I felt that the handheld camera work did not work in that film. It should have, but it didn't. In this movie, it takes us right into the story. And while you have this sort of documentary feel, because you're right in the characters' faces, right in their lives, and there are moments where there are fourth wall breaks. There's one moment in particular in the movie. It's Zach Braff. Zach Braff plays their son. He's in the movie for about 6 seconds. Barely see him. You wouldn't know it was him unless you knew it was him, kind of thing. There's a moment in the movie where they're at 21 Club. And it seems like they shot just as regular guests at the restaurant. Like they figured out a way to do this and do 30 seconds. But there's a moment that Woody Allen clearly goes off script, and he's introducing Anjelica Huston. Woody's in book publishing. And Anjelica Huston is one of his best clients, one of his top clients. And Anjelica clearly is trying to take Woody away from Diane. She so desperately wants this little nebbishy guy she wants to have his way with him, and vice versa, very, very clearly. And Diane's starting to think that, yeah. So Woody, as Diane expresses her disgust with the fact that he seemed to be all over his author, and this really was an accidental meeting, didn't know that they were going to be there. And Woody turns to Diane and says something like, she's dangerously sexual, not in the script. Diane Keaton turns and literally looks into the camera as if she thinks that Woody has just blown the take. He left it in the movie. The line is so good, and her reaction, even though she kind of breaks the fourth wall, he leaves it in the film. And this sort of almost eye in the sky documentary feel goes throughout the film, even though there is some kind of stylistic shots and some creative editing that Woody does and, presumably did in post-production. But the movie, and the irony of the title Manhattan Murder Mystery, that was the original working title for Annie Hall, often cited as Woody Allen's certainly most pioneering, visionary, groundbreaking film. I would put Hannah and Her Sisters above Annie Hall. If you're asking me what was the best movie he ever made, I think I would have Hannah and Her Sisters first. But Annie Hall originally was way longer. There was hours and hours of footage, and one of the segments of that film had to deal with a murder mystery, hence the title, Manhattan Murder Mystery. And when Woody was making this film, I believe that was also the working title, and then he just said, you know what, fuck this. It fits the film, and it does fit the film. Most of the characters are, at worst, upper middle class, white people. Some of them are Jewish. We don't know about all of them. But they're living a certain kind of life. And they get involved in this crazy mystery, which doesn't really seem like much of a mystery, but the title wouldn't make sense. And Diane Keaton snooping and nosing around, if it didn't go anywhere, you really wouldn't have a movie. So the basic setup is, and we get this right away, and the two, as I mentioned, the chemistry. We first meet them. By the way, the opening title sequence, it's a top 5 all-time title sequence for me. You have the kind of Cole Porter, Bobby Short classic, I Happen to Like New York. And as this old 40s tune is playing on, I happen to like New York, I happen to like this town. As it's playing, you have a helicopter shot. I don't know if it was created for this film or whether Woody used, stock footage or found footage or whatever. But you have a helicopter shot of New York City, Manhattan, Midtown at night. And it moves around, and there are certain spots we recognize. And then we realize that we are stopping on Penn Station, Madison Square Garden, as it looked circa 1991-92. And then we go inside the garden, and Woody, who famously has season tickets for the Knicks, and I don't know about the Rangers, but in the world of this movie, he's got baller seats, he and Diane, to a Ranger game. And within about 5 seconds, the first time we meet Larry and Carol Lipton at this Ranger game, we already have them figured out, because Diane's body language, the kind of half-hearted way she claps, she doesn't want to be at this fucking Rangers game. He's into it, and she would like to be anywhere else than at this Ranger game. In these, there probably now would be like $4,000 seats a game kind of seats, but she wants nothing to do with this. And she's frustrated, and we see it, it's written all over her, and it immediately we're like, okay, we get these characters. So as they go home, they meet their neighbors, and a terrific older actor, Jerry Adler, who I believe is still with us. He played Esh on The Sopranos. For those who don't know the name, if you watch The Sopranos, he was the older Jewish gangster, Esh, who ends up, working with Tony or whatever. Woody and Diane meet this older couple, and the older couple invites them in for coffee, and Woody immediately gets easy laughs by doing his neurotic shtick, but doing it in a way that is just, no matter how many times you watch this scene, it's funny. He doesn't want to hang out with this couple. There's a Bob Hope movie I want to watch. He just wants to go home. He's had a long day. They went to the game. He's tired. There's a Bob Hope movie on. I just want to watch this fucking movie. They go in, they schmooze, they have coffee. The guy, Paul House is his name, he shows him his stamp collection 3 or 4 times. Woody is losing his shit. They end up going back to the apartment where they live. And there's an interesting conversation. And when I saw the movie, I was still in my teens, and Woody and Diane look very old to me. They're probably supposed to be about the same age that I am now. The fact that they have a grown son who's 22, Big fucking deal. You're 50 years old, you have a 22-year-old kid. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not like they're in their 30s with a 22-year-old kid. But they have a conversation about aging, which Woody keeps kind of poo-pooing it, but Diane is bothered. You can tell she's bothered. Yes, they have a comfortable life. He's a supportive husband. She's a phenomenal cook. She's trying to get pieces together to open a restaurant. He hasn't said we can't do this. We don't have the money. He clearly makes a very good living. Like he would be high echelon at like a Random House or one of the big publishing outfits in the city. So she's troubled by what they have seen because this couple is significantly older than them and they appear to be still vibrant, virile, and vital. And Diane is worried. Without saying it, the spark is gone from our lives, Larry. How often, she even says, and it's one of my favorite moments in the movie, and I remember seeing it in theaters with my dad. The audience was rocking with laughter throughout. I should point out, this is the most raucous crowd, even more so than White Men Can't Jump, which was a great crowd the previous year. The most sustained laughter in any movie I have attended in person, Manhattan Murder Mystery. So Diane has a moment, and it feels like a throwaway, but when we think about it, it's not a throwaway. It's actually very important to get into the mindset. This isn't something, as much as I enjoyed the movie at age 19, I would not have fixated on this. But Diane asks Woody, Carol Lipton asks her husband, Larry, how often, well, first she says, do you still find me attractive? Now, presumably they've been together for at least 2 decades. We don't know this for sure. There's nothing saying happy 25th, but we can surmise they've been together for more than 2 decades. Do you still find me attractive? And Woody is stunned at the question, and he tries to soothe her. And we feel like he's being honest. He's not just placating her to placate her, to shut her up. He's giving her an honest answer. He says, of course. What kind of question is that? Of course. And then she basically says, how often do you think our neighbors, how often do you think they do it? How often do you think they have sex? And Woody, as only he can, and this is another one of those moments where it's hard to figure another actor who could have delivered this line as well as Alan Stewart Koenigsberg, aka Woody Allen. How often do you think they make love? And Woody, without trying to be funny, he goes, oh, I mean, as often as we do it, as much as once a week. The audience was screaming at that line because you're not expecting him to phrase it like that. As much as once a week, as if it's a lot. It's a great thing. So Woody and Diane have met the neighbors, and Diane has seemingly bonded with Mrs. House. Her name is Lillian in the movie. They talk about working out, and they'd seen each other at the gym, again, high-class apartment building in the early 90s. There's a gym, there's this, there's that. And then Woody and Diane return home, presumably the next night or a few nights later, and it turns out Mrs. House has had a heart attack, and she has passed. And Carol and Larry Lipton are both flabbergasted. They're shocked, they're stunned, because we just met this woman. She's full of life. And yes, she's older than us, but she's not that old. She looked like she's probably in her mid-60s. And she was someone who worked out. But Woody's character, Larry, doesn't question what he's presented with. Carol, as Diane Keaton, the gears start to churn in her head. She smells a rat. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. In this case, something is rotten in New York City. And the more they kind of schmooze with Mr. House, the more we become convinced that something is indeed rotten in New York City. Woody plays his role so beautifully. And as I mentioned earlier, that he lets Diane drive the action. He keeps trying to, in his mind, he's trying to protect her because she's, to him, saying crazy shit, doing crazy things, taking actions that could literally land her in prison. But she is single-minded and obsessed. This guy killed his wife. He killed her. I don't know what you're talking about. She was a coroner. She had a heart attack. How do you know he was a real doctor? There was a doctor there, and then Alan Alda is phenomenal, plays one of their friends who is a playwright and has a vivid imagination. And this is another great line. How do you know he was a real doctor? Because I'm not even going to touch that one. The story develops, and there are multiple threads of plot, which are very intriguing and in some cases riveting, because nothing is making sense as the story moves into its second half. Because we saw this woman, she's gone. She had a heart attack. But then she shows up in the New York City transit system. Diane Keaton is at the downtown athletic club. She's at like a wine tasting. And she sees the dead woman on a bus. And she tells her husband. And he, of course, is completely dismissive. Of course she's on the bus. She's on the dead person's bus. She didn't have car fare. Her focus only increases, and she grows more and more obsessed. But the movie is not dark. As much as we're with her, and as much as she takes actions, which, I don't know about this, we feel like there has to be something to it. Just because we've seen more than a couple of movies. There's going to be something other than a wild goose chase here. There is something more than a wild goose chase. But even with that, because I'm not going to spoil it, the plot has more components to it. It's more twisty than it would otherwise appear to be. How could a dead woman show up? What's going on here? Have we entered Salvador Dali's surrealist territory? Or are we still in the grounded reality of New York City in the early 1990s? Again, the handheld camera, the cinema verite style, the moments where there are special effects that don't quite come off properly, and Woody and Diane are having natural reactions to the special effects not quite coming off properly. It all adds to the realism of this film, and how sometimes you can make mistakes and you keep them in the final cut, and it adds to it. It adds to the depth. It adds to the characters. And so Alan Alda, his character, they're family friends, and Anjelica Huston, who, as I mentioned, is one of Woody's top earners as a great author, and she wants to have an affair with Woody. We're not really sure. We know Woody is attracted to her, but he doesn't seem to be advancing upon her. It's the other way around. Alan Alda very clearly wants to get with Carol. And the way the movie starts to play out, you're not really sure what's going to happen, because Anjelica certainly has her ways. And her character is very interesting because we know what she wants, but she tries to stay to a certain side of the line. She is not a femme fatale who is going to go out of her way to try to hurt him. We get the sense that if he shows the slightest inclination, then it's going to happen, but not until. So we can have respect for her character, quote unquote. Alan Alda very clearly wants Diane. And his character's name is Ted, the playwright. And Woody really wants nothing to do. Larry Lipton wants nothing to do with this, what he thinks is this preposterous, absurd investigation into a homicide that wasn't a homicide. The woman had a fucking heart attack. What's wrong with you people? But Alan Alda, because we know what his ultimate intentions are, separating Diane Keaton from her clothing, he decides to kind of pinch hit for Larry and do the investigation along with Carol. Now, Alan Alda does have the ulterior motive, his character of Ted. He wants to get with Diane. But he actually thinks that she's probably right. He thinks that there's something sinister here. He's not just doing it to get her clothes off. Yes, we know he wants to get her clothes off. But he really thinks that this guy probably bumped her off. And there is a moment in this movie where Alan Alda, wonderful actor, to TV show MASH, and had a pretty successful film career. He's fantastic in Martin Scorsese's The Aviator as a kind of a heel character opposite DiCaprio's Howard Hughes. But there's a moment where Alan Alda as Ted is with Carol, Diane Keaton as Carol, and they're in a car, and they're doing what amounts to a very dull, boring, nobody has a cell phone. They're just basically staking out. They're looking for a particular woman who they think, her They think her name is Helen, and they think she lives in a certain building. Like they've done a little bit of detective work. Well, how would you, if you were staking someone out, this is not really something I ever thought about until seeing this movie, but if you're doing a stakeout, you don't have to be a cop. You could just be doing this kind of low-level Philip Marlowe detective work. You're in a car, you have your donut, you're swapping stories of the love affair that almost was, and you're trying to figure out, well, if we see this person we're looking for, what are we supposed to do? How are we going to know that it's them? Right? There's no internet. They can't Google them. They can't say, well, look her up on Facebook. This movie's shot in 1992. What are you supposed to do? Well, all they know is that her name is Helen. They've never seen a picture of her. They just know that her name is Helen. Thanks to Diane's illegal investigation, she figured out this woman's name is Helen. So a young woman, probably in her early 30s, comes walking near this building where they're staking out. And I remember, they don't know if it's her. And Alan Alda starts screaming, "Helen! Duck, duck! Helen!" When the woman turns, the audience is screaming with laughter again. They know it's her. That's how you would have done it. Because nowadays, you would just see her and know, oh, yeah, that's the woman from the Helen Moss Facebook page. That's her. Oh, yeah, I got her on TikTok. That's her. They wouldn't have had to scream the name. But as soon as they scream and yell and she turns, we know that it's her. That is definitely a top 10 funniest moment in a movie. And it's a moment you're not expecting to be that funny. Just the way Alan Alda screams that, "Duck, duck." Woody's character, Larry, fears that he is going to lose his bride. And we know he loves her. And he wasn't full of shit when he kept saying, "There's nothing to this, sweetie. There is no mystery." The woman, she passed. It happens. You know? Well, why didn't she tell me she had a heart condition? She had no trouble telling me about her hysterectomy in the first 2 minutes. I don't know. But then he's afraid. Number one, he's afraid that she might be right. And number two, he's afraid of losing her. And Larry Lipton has shown very little vulnerability in this movie. Despite the fact, little nebbishy Woody Allen, he's actually a pretty upfront, and we know he's good at his job. And despite his size, he's somebody that other people take seriously. And he's afraid he's going to lose her. So rather than continue to let my friend Ted, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, hang out with my wife, it's actually Anjelica Huston that points out to him, if you want her, Larry, you've got to fight for her. Nobody said this was going to be easy. You got to fight for her. So Woody then steps in and solves the mystery with his bride. And the way the plot plays out, and no spoilers, this is another movie. The 94% on Rotten Tomatoes is not an accident, and Manhattan Murder Mystery is available to rent on Amazon Prime and Apple and other streamers. I don't like spending anyone's money. I don't. But if I may say, this movie is worth the $3 because you will be entertained and laughing and on the edge of your seat for close to 2 hours. Woody and Diane solve a mystery. And I remember watching the film, and I already was a big fan of Annie Hall and had seen Crimes and Misdemeanors and some of, the other Woody Allen works in this ballpark. Manhattan, I'm not the biggest fan of. There are those in the film scholar world who will argue that that is actually Woody Allen's masterpiece. I don't agree. And I'm not sure that the characters of Larry and Carol Lipton could ever be Annie Hall and Alvy Singer from Annie Hall. But I already, even as a 19-year-old watching this film in 1993 and being dazzled and thrilled and laughing my you-know-what off for almost 2 hours, I was impressed by the way this seemingly insignificant story had me hooked to such an extent and wondering, how is this going to turn out? How is Woody going to keep Diane away from Alan? How is Woody going to keep himself away from Anjelica? And what the fuck happened to Mrs. House? So there's a moment in the movie where Alan Alda's character, and Woody, it's just kind of funny, this isn't really a spoiler, he sets up their friend's head, the man that's going to steal his wife, with Anjelica's character. Well, they're both writers. It kind of makes sense. I think he knows who she is, but she's not familiar with his. Like, he's represented as a successful playwright in the world of the movie. There is an incredible scene in a restaurant that I think is supposed to be just across the GWB from New York City into Jersey. It's a super fancy restaurant. And the four principals, Woody, Diane, Alan Alda, Anjelica Huston, are trying to, with the four of them, they're all presented as intelligent people. Yes, they're kind of funny, and Woody's a nebbish, and Diane is wacky and zany, but these are not stupid people. They are not presented as characters we're supposed to laugh at, more that we're supposed to laugh with. And in this scene, as they go over the pieces of the plot that we know as the audience, and they're trying to put together what probably happened, it is a fantastic scene because we rewind, the movie kind of does rewind flashback type stuff, and we see events again that we had seen earlier in the film. And we realize this is probably what happened. It makes sense because there's no reason to believe that when Diane Keaton's character saw the woman who died on a bus, she couldn't have gotten that wrong. So if you start from the point, that's the same woman, what do we have? Is it a twin? What's going on here? So Woody's character, who spends the first half of the movie kicking and screaming, desperate to not get involved in this apparent murder mystery, he actually shows a little bit of moxie, a little bit of chutzpah, despite the fact that he's scared shitless. And this is the really kind of wholesome part that isn't you're not beaten over the head with this. He is more scared of losing Carol than of losing his life, because you get the idea, for all the jokes and all the, the gags, he loves her with every fiber of his being. And he is afraid that if he's not there for her this time, he's going to lose her forever. And he can't have that happening. So he walks into the lion's den repeatedly, and you could say it's not particularly believable how the story wraps up, but it wraps up exactly as it should for this sort of fall down funny comedy with a really interesting mystery at its core. What happened to Lillian House? None of this makes any sense. And as the movie approaches its conclusion, we get the sense that the personal danger has passed, that Alan Alda has accepted. I may never get with her, but you know something? It's okay. And Woody is never going to get with Anjelica, and Angelica's character seems okay with it. It's a rare story, and here's the only spoiler. But in this kind of comedy, the warmth that we feel towards the characters, all of them, at the end is earned because of the crazy contortions of plot. And when it's all said and done, everything is logical. It's a pretty good plan, a pretty good idea that the bad guys came up with in the heat of the moment. In a moment of crisis, they hatched an unbelievable scheme, which would have worked were it not for Carol Lipton and her husband, Larry Lipton, as played by the magnificent Diane Keaton and the still fire and still fucking hilarious Woody Allen. 1993's Manhattan Murder Mystery, written and directed by Woody Allen, starring Woody, Diane Keaton, Alan Alda, Anjelica Huston, and Jerry Adler. The 13th entry in our continuing series of the best movie you've never seen. This has been episode 140 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this, again, very rainy, windy, miserable Wednesday in New York. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you've caught this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 141 real soon. Till then, peace.